So this panel is interpreted in French and English for those connecting online. And I am Sara Lafuente. I'm a researcher at the ETUI, working on workers' participation. And together with my colleague, Marcus Meyer, who's senior researcher at ETUI, sitting here in the room, we propose to put this panel together. The aim is basically to situate the importance of workers' participation in the agenda and the fight against inequalities. So workers' voice plays indeed a key role in redistributing political power, of course, in the company, in the workplaces, but also, as we will see today, beyond the organization, in society at large. So looking into ways to theorize democracy at work, democracy within firms, and to implement this democracy in practice is essential to redress this democratic gap that we find in our societies. So when you see the abstention rate, for instance, that we saw now recently in the legislative elections in France, over 53%, well, there are reasons to be alarmed. And this indicates that democracy needs radically revitalizing, and this can come from the roots, and a space where it can be deployed is, of course, the workplace and the firm. So in this panel, we search to stimulate this debate also by bringing together, well, different perspectives, opening a bit the traditional frames in which we discuss industrial democracy in the trade union movement as well. So bringing in other actors, experiments, and even real utopias, we could say, in the discussion of workplace democracy. And for this, we count with a range of amazing speakers that kindly accepted our invitation. So thank you to them. First, I will present Andrew Combers. He's connected online. Andrew is professor in regional political economy at the University of Glasgow. And he's researcher in economic geography, political economy, and economic democracy. So he has written two quite reputed books in connection with economic democracy, of course, quite recently. One is Reclaiming Public Ownership, Making Space for Economic Democracy. And the other one, The Case for Economic Democracy, which was published in 2020. Then we have Agnes Ackerman. She will speak afterwards. She's professor of regulation of labor and head of department at the IAS at University of Amsterdam. She's specialized in policy networks, corporatism, and industrial relations. And she works particularly on how and why employers suppress workers' voice and what effects that could bring to political preferences and to the political system more largely. Then Andrea Bassi, who's also our colleague connected online. He's associate professor of sociology at Bologna University.
Good morning.
And he specialized on non-profit organizations and on measuring also the organizational performance and social impacts of non-profit. He has actually a lot of experience himself as a director of several non-profit institutions. And today he will share some of his research findings and knowledge about the work, the phenomenon or sort of experiment of worker buyouts in the Italian region of Emilia-Romagna in Italy. So it's a kind of ongoing experiment of workers' control. Then we have Isabel Ferreras, here on my left, professor in the Department of Political and Social Science and at the Economic School of Université Catholique de Louvain. She's also senior research associate at the Harvard Labor and Work-Life Program and president of the Royal Academy of Sciences and Arts in Belgium. And she's very active since the pandemic, also orchestrating a global movement on democratizing work, which I know well because I'm also involved in this, and has worked extensively on how to bring the democratic rule into firms and introducing an interesting concept of bicameral principle of government within firms, which I think she will present later. And finally, we have Stan de Spichelare, our discussant in this panel. So Stan is Director of Policy and Research at Uni Europa, so the European Trade Union Federation of Services. He's also teaching in University Ghent. He's a professor there. and also a good friend of the ETY, where he was a senior researcher for some years. And that gave us the opportunity to discuss a lot about workplace democracy. So without further ado, I'll leave the floor to them, just to say that they will first intervene for 8 minutes each, so that we can allow for discussion afterwards. Then Stan perhaps will bring on the comments and some questions to have a first round with the speakers. And then I suggest to open for the audience here, bring a few questions, so a first round, and then open to the Q&A. I think that organizes a bit, if that's okay with you. So please, Andrew, then we will start with you. The floor is yours. And if any problem with sharing, I see you're sharing your slides, so you can show them directly.
Can everybody see that?
Yes. Yeah. Only maybe if you can expand. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. Well, thanks first of all for inviting me here today to speak. It's really important topic and session, and great that we're discussing these things with such a great panel and audience. What I'm going to talk about today is some work I've been doing since 2000, and this really kicked off in about 2015 when we got a research grant from the British Economic and Social Research Council to really rethink seriously what we mean by economic democracy. And as Sarah's already said, I think one of the issues for us was to take economic democracy outside the firm, really, to think about how we democratize the economy more broadly, while still recognizing the importance of collective action and workers' rights within the firm and through trade unions as well. So I'm going to sort of skip through this presentation. There's quite a lot of slides, but I've only got 8 minutes, so I'll really just touch on the major points I want to highlight really today. So I guess the framing of this and why we're interested in economic democracy obviously is a broader context of political economy, and in particular the last 40-50 years of neoliberal governance and all that's meant for economic inequalities. This is obviously taken from the famous work of Piketty, which illustrates how workers' wages and income inequality have gone backwards over the last 50, 60 years or so, and the growing share of income held by the richest in the world. And that raises a series of questions, I think, which are the kind of background context to today about deepening inequalities, the extent to which we're perhaps moving towards a kind of post-democratic society, increasingly ruled in the interests of elite, and also the sense of alienation and marginalization felt by many from the way that the political economy is developing globally and locally and nationally. And of course, we've written about this as part of our project. It explains some of the kind of right-wing populist backlash, the rise of Trump, even Brexit, and all kinds of other things. And I guess what we find problematic in a lot of the discourse you get, particularly in the liberal mainstream media, is the extent to which there's a suggestion of a crisis of democracy, but very seldom is economic democracy actually taken seriously or even mentioned in those kind of debates. And for us, economic democracy goes to the heart of the problems that we face with power inequality and justice at the moment. So what we've done with our work is we've tried to go back to first principles really and think about what a broader conception of economic democracy might mean that can tackle some of these issues and perhaps go beyond some of the ways we've thought about economic democracy in the past. And just briefly, I think one of the problems we have with conventional forms of economic democracy is really it tends to be very narrowly defined in terms of the economy as a whole. It's usually conflated with industrial democracy and to some extent a very dated conception of the organization of production. It tends to revolve in two ways, really. There are two kind of key themes to established approaches. The first is really a focus on trade unions and employment relations. And the second way in which economic or industrial democracy is talked about is really a focus on cooperative and forms of employee ownership or collective ownership. And those are both debates I've engaged with in the past, and they're still important. I should emphasize that. But we in the kind of work we're doing here, we want to kind of go beyond that to ask more fundamental questions about the democratic nature of the economy at the same time. Because actually one of the things I want to put across today is I think by perhaps an over-focus on collectivism, collective ownership, collective action, means that we've perhaps given away too much ground on the rights of the individual and democracy to the political right and perhaps to corporate interests. So as Sarah's mentioned, I've written about this elsewhere. I mean, and I can share these slides, and I've got lots of material I can share with people if they want to follow up with me after this meeting. But for me, I guess our broader conception of economic democracy has three key pillars, and I've outlined these. It says, Sarah says in one of the books that I've written recently. And for me, the three pillars really are starting off with individual economic rights. What does it mean for individuals to have economic rights, particularly over their labour? The second pillar then becomes about issues around collective ownership, because the way that we conceive of individual economic rights is the individual cannot be divorced from wider society. So we're not talking about the classic individual of mainstream economics, but we're talking about a socialized individual who is always in some way, when it comes to work and producing things, is always engaging and interacting with others, very socialized sense of the individual. So that leads us on then to think about, okay, one of the ways in which you prosecute individual economic rights is actually through diverse forms of collective ownership, which might sound counterintuitive to start, but in the way that we lay it out with a kind of socialized individual, it kind of makes sense. And then the third pillar really, and this really is getting us to think about the economy more broadly. How do we create more deliberative and knowledgeable publics capable of intervening and participating in the economy more generally? And one of the things we've done with our work is we've tried to link kind of radical political economy, Marxist, workerist perhaps, conceptions of economic democracy with older traditions of individual liberalism that come from people like Dahl and Dewey. I'm gonna skip through these slides, but the kinds of people that we're interested in then are kind of an older kind of radical form of liberalism that actually was very much thinking about individual rights and what that meant in a much more radical way before the kind of individual became captured by the kind of neoliberal thought project and collective. So people like John Dewey for me are very interesting. Also the work of Hannah Arendt, who talks about individuals always being diverse but coming together in kind of common interests. And there's also the work of people like Ellerman and John Stuart Mill. So what we've done with our project, and the slide I've just shown you, it really sketches out our broad framework for how we move beyond these three spheres, these three prerequisites to think about critical spheres of the economy and the kind of institutions or policies that might come out of that. We've begun to write some of this up. There's a paper I've mentioned there in Work Employment Society, which is published, again, which I'm happy to share with people. So what we wanted to do, first of all, is sketch out what a broader conception of economic democracy looked like, and how we operationalize or institutionalize that. And then in the last few years, we've been doing some work really to begin to do some research around, well, okay, we have a broader conception of economic democracy, but how does that link to issues of justice and inequality? So what we've done is we've begun to do some statistical work, which begins to look at the relationship between our version of economic democracy and inequality and social justice. We've also identified different spheres. The workplace as one sphere. What we call associational economic democracy is the sort of second sphere. That's perhaps the traditional way in which we think of industrial democracy, as trade union representation or cooperatives. A third sphere then is thinking about radically about, well, how democratic is the economy geographically and sectorally across the entirety of national economies as a whole, and we try to think about indicators that would measure that. And then our fourth sort of sphere for thinking about economic democracy is looking at the broader macroeconomy and how that's governed. How do we look at indicators that tell us about the levels of democracy in that broader macroeconomic decision-making framework? And you can see the kind of things that we're thinking about there. What we then produced is we produced a ranking of what economic democracy looks like across the OECD using these four spheres. And not surprisingly, I think for people in this room, in this audience, the economic democracy maps onto a kind of varieties of capitalism, sort of framing in a way. Not surprisingly, it's very strong in the Nordic countries. It's a lot weaker when you get into the Anglo-American countries if you look at it across the OECD. And I think these findings are quite striking in terms of they basically identified that there's still very variegated patterns of economic democracy. We've also done some work looking at the relationship between economic democracy and inequality. We're just at the start of this work, really. We're trying to get some of this work published. But I think we can say that there are important relations, and whether you express that graphically or whether you look at the correlations, there are important relationships between, or positive relations between economic democracy and levels of equality. The countries that have weaker economic democracy tends to be those that have higher levels of inequality, and where the income of the rich is much more concentrated than elsewhere. So I think while we wouldn't want to overclaim at the moment, we're still trying to get papers published through the academic review process. I think we do think there's some interesting relations between economic democracy and lower levels of inequality that come out of our results. We've also begun to look at issues around productivity. And I think this is probably quite interesting for intervening in mainstream debates. It does seem that there's a strong relationship between high economic democracy levels and high levels of labor productivity in particular, which I think might be very important weaponry to contest some of the mainstream framing of those debates. I'm probably running out of time, but
Andrew,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, could you just wrap up a bit and then maybe leave for the round of debate or some?
Sure.
If you have other
yeah, I've got lots of other data I could show you, but I'll just move to and we've actually just produced a new economic democracy index, which is quite exciting. You'll see it here. The countries at the top are broadly the same, but it kind of gives us some data over the period of austerity, which is quite interesting. So I think what I'll say just to wrap things up is to say that what we found in our research so far, particularly the research that we've done in Europe, and there's a paper that I can refer you to on that, which I think Sarah has also shown on this slide. What we found in Europe is if you look at the period since 2000. Austerity and kind of cut real policy retrenchment around individual economic rights seems to be reducing economic democracy quite markedly, although we do find variation between countries, particularly the Nordic countries, where trade unions and perhaps collective action remains a lot more stronger. Seems to be doing better in economic democracy terms than some of the countries in the south and the east of Europe. So I think one of the things that we find is that those countries that are doing best in economic democracy still have traditions of strong trade unionism, collective action, and actually political mobilization. I can say a little bit more about that if we need to. But the final point I'd make is that we do find in our research the kind of levels of economic democracy and variation do tend to map out quite well with the kind of varieties of capitalism literature when you look at it across the OECD countries. Okay, so there's a lot there we can pick up in debate. But hopefully you've got something out of that, and we can discuss more in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Fascinating to start and frame the debate with your presentation. I will leave the floor to Agnes Ackerman, again with a broader perspective of this on this topic. Can I help? Maybe you can. But the technicians are putting it online. Could you please show the PowerPoint of Agnes? Yeah, perfect.
I'm not sure whether this is working. Will be. Yeah, it's open. Is it open? Yeah. Okay. So I don't have to yell. Okay. Thank you. I'll be sharing the results of a 6-year project I've been doing with a group of others, of course. And the main message is already on the first page. So if anything happens during the coming 8 minutes, you already know what I'm going to talk about and what is the main finding. The main finding is that workplace voice matters for people's political voice. Okay, this is not working. Somehow the invisible hand is also at play here. So the structure of my presentation, although it's only 80 minutes, I think it's important to have some structure for you. I'll be explaining the idea of why these two things are related. Then I'll be giving some ideas, theoretical ideas, why workplace voice and political voice are related. And then I'll be discussing the general findings of our project. So as you already noticed, I will not talk about data methods, and I'll be happy to talk about them after the presentation. If I had 20 minutes, you would learned during the presentation these things, but I only have 8, so making me a little bit nervous about the next slide. Okay, the idea. So the idea is that work and political voice are connected through workplace voice. So, and with workplace voice, I understand speaking up for yourself, co-determination, participation in unions, participation in the work, etc. But especially speaking up, so more the direct forms of workplace participation. And the second thing we investigated in this project was how labor market institutions, for instance, employee rights, labor law, the level of protection, unionization, etc., affect this workplace voice. So in order to establish sort of indirect link between how we regulate work and how we manage work to people's political voice. And political voice can be participation, so real behavior, but also political preferences, attitudes. So that's the idea. And I'll be talking about this part, skipping the labor market institutional defects. So 4 theoretical, distinctive theoretical ideas how workplace voice and political voice could be connected. The first one is that political voice can be a substitute for workplace voice. For instance, people feel not comfortable or their voice is neglected in the workplace, and they try to find another channel to voice their complaints or concerns. Not going to talk about that one today. Second, work can be a training ground for political participation. I will be talking about that one. Yes. A third theoretical idea is that supervisor and co-worker responses to voice are generalized to political authorities and other societal groups. I will be talking about that one also. And a quite new one, so I won't be talking about that one, but it's quite interesting that work is a source of misrecognition, for feelings of misrecognition. And that's a rather new one. And I wanted to introduce you to that one, but I'm doing that maybe in the discussion. So the first theoretical ideas, somehow there's a delay in, yes. So how about a training ground? So what's the theoretical idea? It's not my idea, it's not a new idea. That political participation stimulates, workplace participation stimulates political participation and this is sort of new, political trust. So with workplace participation, work council, union participation, political discussions at work as well, and direct voice. And we focus in this project on direct voice, so speaking up, because we wanted to introduce more common day-to-day experience with this sort of political behavior at work than is commonly done in research, because it's affecting more people. Because being in participating in a working council or work council and in a union is somehow for most people not that common. And we wanted to know everyday experience of a lot of people with political behavior and political context at work. So the idea is, the mechanism that is proposed in literature also is that political participation at work, so workplace voice, trains people in different kinds of skills, political skills, such as mobilization of others, communication with supervisors, superiors, authorities, and people gain a sort of perceptiveness and acknowledgement of others' opinion and interest. And they also, for instance, learn how to compromise and to value compromises. And more importantly, it increases people's confidence in doing so. And the idea is that if you learn something in one sphere, you will using it in another sphere. So if you train things at work, you will be able to participate in politics. The other mechanism is that people generalize support of lack thereof for their voice to other spheres of life, in this case, political spheres. So responses, and this is not participating or not, this is how others respond to your voice. Responses to worker voice inform people, so workers, about the level of support they can expect from authority figures at work and also different social groups, the peers at work. And the idea is that responses to voice are formative experiences at work. So these formative experiences teach you how others, authority figures in society, political authority figures, support your voice and your interest. And the other idea is that the responses of your colleagues, your peers, inform you about who to trust and who to trust on for solidarity and support in society. So for instance, if you have a negative experience or you lack the support of your immigrant, say, Eastern European colleagues, you will generalize this experience to the wider group of Eastern European people in society. This is the idea. And to give you some idea how we investigated this, this direct voice, this speaking up, this is the sort of responses we measured. So it could be supportive. My supervisor helped me to solve the issue. So it could be a wide range of voice themes. So not getting paid, too high work pressure, no career opportunities, unsafe, unhealthy, either social or physical work conditions, could be a whole range. We asked them, when they have voiced the issue, how the supervisor responded. But it could also be suppressive. My supervisor ignored the issue or made my work less pleasant or threatened me, intimidated me, etc. The general patterns of findings. Last slide, perfect timing. What we find is small, so statistical, small, but significant effects. And it's significant, but we also have a large data set, so it's easy to accomplish significant, but these are small effects. But you have to keep in mind, these are effects of only one incident in 1 year. So if there's a sort of accumulation of incidents, we're not sure yet, you might expect larger effects if it builds up. The effect of suppression, so at the bottom of the list, is larger than the effect of support. That's interesting, huh? So it makes more. It makes more of a impact exactly when people's voice are suppressed by the supervisor than the effect of support. So and it has an effect on populist attitudes and populist voting behavior, feelings of misrecognition, political and workplace voice efficacy, and political trust. The effect of suppression and lack of solidarity or support of co-workers is also larger than the effect of supervisor suppression. This is interesting. It is more important what your colleagues do for your feeling of misrecognition, at least, than it is what your supervisor does. Somehow, maybe you are expecting suppressive responses from your supervisor, but not of your colleagues. I'm not sure what is behind this finding. Political socialization is able to compensate. So political socialization at work is able to compensate for educational differences in political socialization. This is very important. And we also know it's difficult to isolate the effects of work, of political socialization at work, from prior socialization. So I have to be cautious about the results. This is true for immigrant entitlement and political trust. There's also a bidirectional relationship. So political attitudes also affect the probability of particular responses. We're not sure, we have some theoretical ideas why it is the case, but we see that happening for immigrant entitlements and also for populist attitudes and voting behavior. And finally, workplace participation increases political participation, and even the negative experience. So even if you meet negative responses to political participation, that does not decrease your political participation. And this is interesting as well. So I didn't show the effects of labor market institutions, and we could talk about it later. There's also a paper on the website that investigates one of them. I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Agnes. Very interesting on the power of education, of workplace democracy as education. And yeah, as Agnes said, the publications, the references are online also for Andrew Combers and for the other speakers. So yeah, I encourage you to consult these after the session, maybe to get more the details of the methodologies and so forth. So thank you. Let's go now to our next speaker, Andrea Bassi, who will intervene online. And Andrea, you can show your slides directly. If you have any issue, just let us know. So again, 8 minutes. I will let you know when you have 1 minute left, if that's okay.
Thank you. Do you hear me clearly? Hello, do you hear me?
A bit low. Maybe the technicians could raise the volume for the room.
Now?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Now it's
Andrea.
better. Okay, good morning, everybody. I will present a case studies, a very small, limited, but concrete and practical case studies on an experience of worker buyout, meaning employee-owned enterprise. And the question that we pose is why the employee-owned enterprises are more resilient than normal corporate business, especially in time of economic and financial crisis. So the worker buyout definition is a process for which the workers or employee of a private corporation in crisis, at risk of failure of bankruptcy, relieve the ownership of that corporation and became the legal owner of the enterprise, usually adopting a cooperative legal status. In Italy, we do not have a complete census of worker buyout experience, but we have several statistical sources. One is ISTAT, that is the Italian National Institute of Statistics. Another one is the Chamber of Commerce. And so far we have traced around 250 worker buyout experience. And more or less 220 are financed by a specific financial institution, that is CFI, which is an agency that has been founded by the Ministry of Economic Development together with the three main umbrella organization of representation of cooperatives. So we have data about 59 worker buyout experience that create cooperatives. And I will give you a few information about these 59 worker buyout. More or less, half of them is located in North in the north part of the country. This is a problem and a typical situation. Unfortunately, in Italy, then the northwest and the northeast part of the country are more active economically and not only than the south. 3/4 of these worker buyout are in the industrial sector, so not in the services or agriculture. And 17 worker buyout experience of these 59 are located in Emilia-Romagna. So the Emilia-Romagna, it's eventually the most inviting Italian region for the WO phenomenon. Just a few words to say if you are not familiar with the Italian system of cooperation. We have 3 main national federation. One is Lega Coop, which is left oriented. The other one is Conf Cooperative, which is Christian Catholic oriented. And the third one is AGCI, which is more like oriented. These 3 umbrella organizations are gathering inside them all the diverse typology of cooperatives. So I know that, for example, in France, you have a federation for agricultural cooperatives, federation for, I don't know, bank cooperatives. In Italy, no, we have 3 main federations that include all the type of cooperatives. And very recently, they create an alliance. So they are going to merge together in a single huge umbrella federation. A very important also is this institution that is an institutional investor that was set up in 1986 by the law so-called Legge Marcora. And as I said, behind the Ministry of Economic Development, it has several cooperatives and also mutualistic funds as member. And okay, the Emilia-Romagna region in 2018. There are some information that 1,500 jobs were saved through the worker buyout experience. So very quickly, I have still 3 minutes. I would like to show you this example, the Raviplast. It is an industry of plastic packaging. So the industry that was owned by a family got bankruptcy, failed in July 2013. So the mayor of the city of Ravenna created a negotiation table with the Chamber of Commerce, the Industrial Association, the Small and Medium Enterprise Association, the Artisan Association, and the cooperative movement in order to present a project to the Ministry of Economic Development, Special Commissioner. There was a call of interest. So the time was very tight, only a few months during the summer to present this project. Actually, they succeed, and the project was successful. So concerning the worker involvements, at the beginning there were 90 workers when the firm got bankruptcy. Only 50 of them, I mean more or less the half of them, accepted to remain in this project. So other half of them just left, trying to find another job. Out of these 50 workers, 35 workers declared that they were available to enter in the new cooperatives. At the end of the project, 24 workers became the founder of the cooperatives. So the cooperative has an asset of 850,000 euro that they were more or less splitted into 400,000 euro from the financement of this institution and 400,050 euros from the worker, with an average involvement of 20,000 euro per worker. Okay, so there
Andrea,
yes,
you have one more minute, okay?
Yes, I know.
Not easy
so,
to moderate.
there are some successful factors. The first one, of course, is economic sustainability. If the economic activity of the enterprise is not, marketable, it is useless to try to do cooperatives. The second one is the quality of the management. We should have at least one or two managers of the former enterprise that really get engaged and want to spend the rest of their professional life in cooperatives. Very important factor is the existence of an enabling environment, so the territorial context, the municipality and the other actor, Chamber of Commerce. And the fourth one is the possibility to have the credit access, so to have a financial partner very, very strong. So sorry to be late, thank you, and I will happy to answer to some question in the debate.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Very concrete example that will definitely be useful for the debate later. So I'll give the floor to Isabel Ferreras now, our last speaker, and then Stan will comment. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, perfect. And so it would be great to see the slides. So I'm going to talk about a specific piece in this whole debate about economic democracy, which is the piece of the corporation. Obviously, this is only one piece of the puzzle, but it's a central piece in a capitalist society where the arrangements of power are very specific. And so this is the title, which I chose very much in line with the title of this panel. And thank you again to the organizers for having set up such an interesting and very well-connected panel, democratizing firms to redress power inequality, deepening unions' role to building worker power. I would like to start with an insight which comes from a legal scholarship, which I think should really be on our mind when we think about that piece of the cooperation within the overall project of economic democracy. The insight is that the corporation is a very specific legal institution, and it's actually not the same as the firm. This is well established in the legal scholarship literature. It's not a leftist perspective. It's a standard mainstream legal scholarship. And the issue then for us as scholars, but also for us or you as actors, and I'm here speaking to the trade union movement, is what do we do with that difference? The corporation is not the same as the firm, and let me explain you just a bit more about that. What is a corporation? A corporation is the legal structuring of capital. And this I take from Jean-Philippe Robé, who's an international expert on this. It's a legal concept that basically identifies a group of so-called capital investors who bring in their money, and they are granted a certificate of incorporation to be able to act as a one moral persona, to have legal personality, to engage their money into whatever economic endeavor that they feel it's relevant. And that legal entity empower a board of directors to mobilize precisely that money, the assets that these capital investors put in the entity. And this is what Robé calls actually the move from using those assets to enter into contracts, labor contracts, commercial contracts. This is what Robé calls to develop a firm, that is to build around the corporation a firm. What you see immediately is that the firm actually, it's so a much bigger entity, obviously, than the corporation. And it's one, I think, that we have not yet properly understood. And from the social sciences, I suggest we should view the firm as a political entity. Why so? Because obviously the firm has economic dimensions. Obviously, as when you think about the state, taxes and has a budget. So the state is also has economic dimensions, but we don't close our mind when we think about the state there to its economic dimensions. Well, for the firm, basically, it's the same. We shouldn't close our mindset to the economic dimensions. Why is it a political entity? Because it's an entity which existence depends on ongoing decisions about the goals of the coordinated action that is pursued within the firm. And those actions are bound up in issues of efficiency and justice all the time and depend on two classes of investment. And I'm here describing the capitalist firm. The investment in capital, obviously, in a capitalist firm, but also the investment in labor. And that investment is absolutely not recognized, obviously, because this is the structure of the government of the firm. Basically, it's the structure of government of the corporation. You have a shareholders assembly, a general assembly meeting, which empowers a board of directors, which empower an executive committee, and they take all the decisions in the name of the shareholders on behalf of the firm. What is that? Well, I think this is basically despotism. We should recognize that this is actually the tying of political rights to govern to those who inject capital. But what do we do if actually the entity is would not exist just by the existence of these capital investments, but depends on these both investments, capital and labor investments. And this is just to show an image that I very much like, the House of Lords in England. It's like England would be governed by the House of Lords, what was originally the House of Lords. It's the representation of those who own the land, the pieces of land of England, which is exactly what is in a corporation, a board. The board represents those who own the shares of the corporation. So that's a property. Property is tied to political rights. I'm not going to talk more about just seeing the time. The key point here is to understand that when I speak about labor investment, is to understand that the labor investors, which is a way to reconceptualize workers, not only those who are employed in a standard labor contract with the firm, but also the outsourced workers, the gig workers, actually all that labor investment, which makes it possible for the corporation to just exist. Well, those are governed by the rules and decisions of the firm. And so we are actually in a situation where all those who are governed, and actually capital investors are not governed, they are just affected by the action of the firm. But those who are governed are in a situation of total political alienation because they have no say on the government of the firm. And so let me inject here the key principle that we should consider facing this situation is that all issues, such as the choice of a CEO, setting major strategies, profit distributions, all those decisions are just too important to be left to shareholders alone. A personal investment of labor, that is of one's body and mind, one's health, one's very life, ought to come with the collective right to validate or veto these decisions. And Sarah mentioned that we started this initiative around democratizing work. And this is a quote, what I just read you is a quote from the Democratizing Work op-ed that we published during the first lockdown. And we are now we just have a book out, which basically gives much more details on the manifesto. Considering the firm as a political entity in the specific situation of political despotism that it faces today, actually, when we look at the history of industrial relations, we find a way to deal with this problem, is to consider that the firm is a political entity in transition. In transition in the sense that, and I'm going to show you just a few slides. So this is the corporation. So basically, the problem is that the representation of capital investors is very well established. It's the corporation. That's what the corporation does. But the representation of labor investors is not. And when you look at the history of industrial relations at the firm level, what you see is actually a path toward the full democratization of the firm. That is the organizing of the voice of workers at the firm level so that it gets a proper channel of representation to wait on the same level, at least, as the capital investors. In countries like Belgium, we are here in Brussels, you find a works council, which provides for the representations of workers. But obviously in countries like Germany, you have co-determination, which is actually super important in this history because it really speaks for the recognition of labor investors as being the central constituency of the firm that needs to be represented at that legislative level, if you want, of the firm. And so Sarah actually did an important historic work by showing that in the original version of co-determination in Montan-Mitbestimmung, there was not only strict parity Mitbestimmung, but for certain decision, and actually just one, the appointment of the director of labor relations, it required a majority within the labor representatives at that supervisory board. And you have here actually the very idea that workers should collectively get the power to validate or veto the decisions of the firm. So this idea of collective veto power is the insight, actually, and I will close with that, the insight that you find along the history of democracy with what I call the bicameral moment. This is why this conception is called economic bicameralism. It's the understanding that actually the constituency that was left out of the government is at some point recognized to bear with the collective veto power on all the decisions of the entity. This actually took place 5 centuries before Christ in Rome, where the plebs got the recognition to have this veto power on all the decisions of the patricians, and it's kept repeating throughout the history of bicameralism. And so bicameralism is the idea to have 2 chambers, but you can very well also imagine to have just 1 chamber inside which you have 2 college of voters within which workers have this ability to position themselves at the majority level. And so, yeah, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. We can leave it there and maybe continue later.
Absolutely.
Thanks, thanks a lot. And now we'll give the floor to Stan to discuss these 4 presentations. See, challenging moment, or raise the first questions, perhaps from the trade union perspective.
Well, I'm going to give also a small introduction, of course.
course.
Obviously, I'm very happy to be here. Why am I so happy to be here? Because I think this panel is very essential for the trade union movement. I think what we're discussing here, democratizing work, democratizing the firm, is really a part of the core of what trade unions should do. And to illustrate that, I will give you two examples, two stories from my life. The first one is about my childhood friend, and he's called Jan, and we were living in the same street. And basically, I had glasses, so I was a little bit better in studying than he, and he had a good football, so he was very good in football, better than I am. We went to high school together, and then we went to university together. And in the end, he didn't really manage to the university, so he became a bank clerk. So really executive work, not very high on the ladder. By now he's very good, so no worries there. But he called me up after roughly 1 month after he started working, and he called me up and he said, "You know what, Stan? All the thing that we learned in high school, all of that stuff, it's a lie. All of that is bullshit. We've been in the same high school. We've learned how to make a proper opinion. We've learned about the importance of political participation. We've learned about the importance of defending your opinion and making a state and arguing and all this kind of stuff. All of that, forget it. If you work, if you're in a company, they don't appreciate any of that. The only thing that they appreciate is you keep your head down, you do whatever your supervisor says. And every time I use the competences of my high school, I get into trouble, I get into shit." And this example, I think, perfectly illustrates a human example, not a scientific example, as my colleagues are showing here, illustrates the link between workplace democracy at work, and political democracy. If you have a workplace where where voice is not appreciated, then how can you expect those people to to be a political citizen, to be an active, critical citizen in society? It's not possible. The second example I want to give you, or story, is from somebody in this room, by the way, who told me on a certain moment and said, "You know what, I was working, and the moment I joined the trade union, the moment I had my first trade union meetings, what I felt was the feeling of emancipation. What I really felt was the feeling of empowerment, of feeling that actually I can change the world." And this second human example shows, I think, the importance of groups, of collective work, of collective organization at work, and the consequence on the attitudes and the political identity of workers. So what I want to say with these two examples is what we're discussing here is the essential part of what trade unions do. It's about emancipating people, and it's about bringing democracy into the workplace. I'm very happy that we have examples here from Workplace Voice. We have examples here with Andrew Cumbers, a little bit more about, let's say, institutional voice. We have examples of co-determination, real co-determination, and we have examples of ownership of firms. Now, what I think, and what that's also leading up to my question that I have for all the speakers, is that one cannot go without the other one. The main thing that we as a trade union do, the main thing that Uni Europa is standing for, is collective bargaining. What we think is that it is essentially what is important is collective bargaining. Why? To rebalance the imbalance of power in the firm. Without collective bargaining, you cannot rebalance the imbalance of power in the firm. And I think that without rebalancing the power difference, individual voice risks being not real voice, and risks being capital-oriented voice. Without rebalancing the difference in power in the firm, co-determination, institutional voice, and decision-making in the company risks being co-responsibility, but without real power. Without rebalancing the power difference in the firm, individual labor rights, individual participation rights, as Andrew Cumbers has explained them, risk being not effective. And so my main question to all the speakers here is, how do you connect your stories? How do you make sure that your stories are linked to a rebalancing of the power in the firm? Because I think in isolation, all of them which are essential, and I hope that I conveyed the message that I support all of it, but all of them risk to come back to us or let's say come back to us in a negative way. So this is my question.
Thank you, Stan. So who would like perhaps to start intervening, connecting So the question, the real challenge that Stan just raised with your work and presentation. Any Andrew or Andrea, perhaps, or yeah, Andrew, please go ahead.
Thanks for Stan for those comments. I completely agree with them all. I think you're right. It's not an either or an or. You need collective organization. You need very strong trade unions, and I think that's a starting point for economic democracy. When we talk about individual economic rights, as I said in my presentation, I think we need to recognize that we're working in the spirit of Ellerman's rights over your work and right. And I think, as all the presentations have really talked about really well, this idea of I think Isabella's point about the workplace being this dictatorship really is something that we need to call out a lot more in our discussions. So I think trade unions and collective action is an important start, but I would then question a little bit what maybe trade unions and those kind of institutions of collective bargaining are actually doing. And I think we need to have an articulation of a very alternative set of agendas around the economy, around tackling capitalism, around climate change. And I think what trade unions and collective actors need to do is they need to move out of the workplace, because strengthening rights at the workplace is critical and very important. But I think we need to have a dialogue, and we need to have an argument and a set of narratives about the economy more broadly and what kind of economy we want. And I think that also ties into sort of issues around the climate emergency, whether we believe in degrowth or growth, or economic growth. I think these are all issues and policies that the trade union movement needs to get more engaged in, and needs to move from perhaps a comfort zone of a kind of middle of the road social democracy to really questioning the nature of global capitalism in a more fundamental way. And I know some trade union actors do that, but I think if we're really going to have a proper agenda for economic democracy, we need to have a set of debates and discussions around these other kinds of policies that are out there, like universal basic income, like working time, and I think we're beginning to rediscover some of the issues and imperatives around that. But it does seem to me that we have to have a strong trade unions in the workplace, but we need to go beyond the workplace. And the final thing I'd say there is that, if you look at the way that the world of work is structured, a lot of workers, their identity is not bound up with individual workplaces. The gig economy and so on means that we need to find ways of organizing people collectively who perhaps have much more fragmented, precarious forms of work. And again, this is happening. There's a lot of self-organization going on at grassroots. But I think if trade unions are to be critical voices in questioning issues of power and inequality, they need to develop narratives and policies that go beyond the workplace. That would be my key take-home point.
Thanks, Andrew. Perhaps would you like, or do you, if you're not inspired now, maybe you yes? Oh yeah. Then please, since you're very shy. So who's next? Isabel?
Yeah, we don't dare, because
please go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you so much, Stan, for this great question. I think it's really about sharing a vision of what a democratic architecture of the economy would be, and indeed what is the role of the unions in that democratic architecture. And I think we have to be very wary these days. We can certainly hear some resonance in some firms that, more participatory ways would be great, and giving more power to the workers is great. But obviously, they certainly do not want to see the unions as a central actor there. And so democratizing the economy, I think, has to go hand in hand with placing the unions at the center of that democratization process, as it has been the only actually collective actor anyway doing it. So it would not make sense in terms of the history of why we are in this position today to maybe claim for more, but also because unions are the only one capable to organize the solidarity between workers between all these levels in that hierarchy of norms, if you want, that the economy is made of. So to be very clear, I think that the intuition of collective bargaining, which is the idea that basically individual workers at their individual level cannot defend properly themselves. So you have to organize that bargaining at the collective level by bringing their collective representatives so that they can face the capital investors who otherwise are always be able to crush them, even when they are organized collectively, they might be. So it means that at the firm level, the idea of this true Montan-Mitbestimmung is actually, in my understanding, it's the idea of collective bargaining brought at home at the firm level, if you want. And so it's really about envisioning an economy that is built from the ground up and the bottom down via collective bargaining at all these levels, where unions are the political vehicle for the representation of workers. In that sense, also, if I may add a word, I think the pieces between a voice channel, when we discuss democratizing the firm, as I did, I'm more into this voice avenue to democratization. And what Andrea and also Andrew are care about is also to democratize capital and ownership. And I think these pieces have to go together. And this is why, if I may add a point about the transition that bicameralism could mean, is that by bringing bicameralism at the firm level, you put actually the labor representatives in a position to learn what it means to govern the firm, so that sooner, better than later, they can actually decide that they don't need a capital chamber, but that they can actually very well govern the firm on their own terms. And then workers' buyout can happen at that very moment, where workers representatives feel that they can actually govern the firm, and it would be the role of public banking, for instance, to provide for the means for workers to collectively buy back, or for the state to get in to really buy the shares of the capital chamber, if you want, so that it can really emancipate firms from the rule of the capital investors. And in that way, we can envision an economy that is really growing largely and quickly becoming democratic, not that the ideal being restricted to the only worker cooperatives that we know today, which are great, but only so marginal, but to bring economic democracy to the entire economy.
Thanks. Agnes, you also wanted to.
Yeah, two comments, two connections of my story to the rebalancing of power question. First, I think the finding that the lack of solidarity of co-workers impacts that much the political voice. I think that demonstrates that the need, probably the importance of solidarity and also collective voice. So that's one thing. The other thing that I was inspired by was in the thing of rebalancing the power is another power imbalance I would like to address, and that is what we observed, and that is already observed many times, is the inequality of access to voice. So collective voice, but also direct voice. We see that people who are easily replaced, so flexible workers, do not have access to direct voice. And we also know that they don't have equal access to voice, collective voice as well. So I was wondering who in fact is in power there within the group of workers. So to the extent that workers have voice, I think it's also unequally distributed. And I would address that question. I would like to have mentioned that and like to address that question also, because We're leaving behind a growing group of workers who lack any voice. So that's my response.
Thanks, Agnes. Andrea, would you like to comment something now, or shall we?
Maybe.
Yes, please.
Just a short remarks about our case studies. That usually the worker union are very cautious and prudent towards WBO. Often they are contrary. Often they suggest the worker not to become a member of the cooperative because, of course, they are afraid that the worker can lose their social safety allowance. Because in this case, the worker will, in case of the bankruptcy of the firm, the worker will receive, around 40,000 euro by the government, and then if they invest this money in the cooperatives, and then if the cooperative fail, they will lose twice. They will lose the first because they were fired by the bankruptcy corporation, and then they will lose all their money if the cooperative fails. So I understand this prudent position of the worker union toward this example. But usually there is, a sort of suspicion from the trade union towards the cooperative experiment in itself, because as the other speaker said, the worker union and the trade union are, bargaining, so they need a counterpart. And in the cooperative experience, there is not a counterpart, actually, because the worker are the owner. They are both the employee and the employer at the same time. So I think I agree with Professor Chambers about the idea that in a post-industrial society, the worker union must a little bit change their focus from inside the corporation to outside, to the interrelationship between the different actors of the society. Otherwise, there is the risk, like a little bit happened in Italy, that nowadays the worker union, they defend only the people that are employed in the public administration or in the big corporation, and they do not defend the young people that are inflexible worker and this worker that bring the pizzas at home in the evening and so on. So this is a little bit my reflection about relationship between worker union and cooperatives ownership.
Thanks, Andrea. So maybe after this round, then, are there any questions in the floor? Perhaps we're running a bit out of time, but perhaps we have time to 2 or 3 questions. No, and we try to address them.
Is this on?
Yeah. Thanks, Marcos.
Yeah. Sure. My name is Jose Luis. I'm from Erasmus University. And my question is regarding to what Andrea just mentioned. How can we realign the incentives so just to provide a very specific example, I interviewed some delivery workers, and they are actually employees of the firm, these gorilla spring delivery workers. And they were telling me, I know that there is a work council, but I'm not really interested in participating if that will demand more time. My time is limited and I have other things to do. So they are already living in precarious conditions in which, of course, time is also a resource that it's constrained for them. They don't have the incentives because there is no a union paying them to participate. And then there is this problem of collective action because they also know that they won't be there for long. So what are the incentives to try to, participate in a firm when I don't see a career pattern and where I don't want to engage. So I don't know if you could tell, my question is open to any panelist, how can we rearrange the incentives so that, you know, at the end, participation has a cost, so make it less costly for the worker to engage, particularly for the most precarious ones. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you please be as brief as possible with your questions? We collect 2 more.
Hi, good morning. Otse Fairo from the ETUI. I have 3 questions. I will just shoot them and then you decide if you want to address them or not. First question for Agnes Ackerman. I would like to know more about the impact of the labor market regulation on the link between workplace voice and political voice, please. For Isabel, how do you think we can regulate this democratization and the political structure of the firm? And if yes, how do we do that? Is it a review or vision of the Consultation and Information Directive, for examples? And last one for Stan. So you say that there is importance of collective agreement. What about consultation? There is a presence of trade union in the consultation process. Do you think it's a fair place to address the imbalance of power? And if yes, is there an opportunity here? And if not, what are the main challenges? Thank you.
but 3 questions in one, sneaky.
Choose one.
We have 3 more. Maybe we do 1 round, yeah. Then we do 1 more, and then we do maybe a second round.
Thank you so much. My name is Emanuela Preiti, and I'm responsible here in Brussels for the Bureau of CISL, the Italian Confederation Trade Union. I was particularly, for me, it's not a question, but most of some comments I would like to share with you. In particular, Stan, let's say, I share a lot what you say. I think that collective agreements and collective bargaining is central in order to rebalance the power, because I see very much what you said, the risk for trade unions to be implied in the governance of the company without having any benefit and a real word in the process. So this is a risk we have to avoid, absolutely. And 2 other elements I would like to bring when we talk about precarious work or let's say the difficulty of people, especially I would like to underline the difficulty of the young people to be engaged in the process with the trade unions. Is from one side is a kind of a cultural element, which implies that nowadays young people are much more individualistic as approach. So for us it's a big task to try to let's say attract new people in our work, and but it's also a cultural element from the company. I can give you my personal example. I was in NL Group, and I still I am a working of NL Group for 25 years. And the moment I announced the company, I will join full time the trade unions. Okay, it was the end of my work experience in NL. So I mean, NL is a big group. It's a kind of corporate social responsibility agreements, a lot of blah blah blah. But at the end, the culture is still there, negative towards the trade unions. Sorry to say that, but it's my personal experience. So I stop here to let others speak. Thank you.
I would maybe add a couple more questions from the chat, because otherwise we won't have time to, and then you can answer more broadly. So we have a question here for Agnes Ackerman. In your research, did you find differences among working people in relation to political participation based on job stability, salary, etc.? Then we have a question regarding the potential correlation. So Ovidiu Goran, sorry, asked if you could elaborate a bit more on the potential correlation between work democracy, democratic organizations, and employee voice, and how could strong trade unions foster such democracy? And then a question on the extent, the possibilities for direct voice and linked with how decision authority is distributed. I don't, it's a very long question, so I don't. To what extent the possibilities for direct voice are determined by the way work is organized and how decision authority is distributed? That's another question from Frank Potts. I'm sorry, maybe the other ones we will leave them for a different panel later. So please choose, pick and choose, because we're a bit running out of time. I'm really sorry about this. Perhaps Isabel, you want to start?
Yes, thank you very much for all these questions. I think just a few key points in terms of the incentive question. I think as long as participation actually is costly and it's connected to what the other person said, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but it's very clear that if the whole structure is actually biased toward capital, it's not, you're taking a big risk to get involved, obviously. And so this is another reason why actually democratizing firms is actually essential to make workers, the workers elected on unions list by their colleagues to be their representatives, to make them as evident, as legitimate as a representative of capital who sits on the board. The company is not, afraid of these guys. It shouldn't be afraid of those who represent the labor investors. And so in that perspective, it's really because today the channels of representations and consultations are too weak, that actually it's costly for workers who get involved, and it's not, it does not lead where it should be, right? And so my only response here would be to say, let's take this very seriously and upgrade the level of power that indeed workers have from the firm level to the entire economy level, obviously throughout the industry level, by really taking seriously collective bargaining as this parity bargaining power. And I would like to add something about the risk to avoid being caught in the projects of the capitalists. This is really where indeed democratizing firms without the unions could go. And this is what I call corporate patriotism, actually. And that should not be the project. The project is economic democracy, to extend democracy into the economy. And so that is really why unions are this collective vehicle for the political representations of the workers, and that should not be questioned. If indeed firms are being democratized, then it will not be questioned anymore. But obviously today we understand why it's questioned. And so the last point is, how do we go for this? I think the action at the EU level obviously is very it's crucial, and it's very encouraging to see that the resolution that was voted by the European Parliament on December 16, just last year, about democracy at work, for which the ETUC really lobbied intensely. There are 6 action levels there through via the revisions of the consultation and directive, information directive, works council directive. All these are crucial means to advance, but it's not going to do enough, obviously, if we don't have the end goal of full democratization of the economy throughout its architecture.
Yes, I will try to answer the 3 questions in one answer. So actually the 2 questions about the research were, did you find any effect or relation to people's political behavior to how their job is regulated? And as a matter of fact, we did. Is sort of an indirect effect. So through their workplace voice, so the thing I was already mentioning previously when answering Stanza's question, what we do find is job security, so the level of protection your labor contracts entail matter for people's workplace voice. So if people worry a lot about their job stability or security, we see that they don't engage that much in voice. They're less probably likely to engage in workplace voice. So yes, there is a relation, and that's controlled for every other, age, education, etc. So it is important whether workers feel protected against retaliation. Second, how to engage the most precarious ones. So how to circumvent or address this effect of job insecurity. Well, easy one to mention, but the most difficult one to solve is to avoid people being in a situation in which they have to worry about their stability of their jobs. Second one would be, referring more abstractly to your question, is cost can be time and other resources, but it's also the expected cost of retaliation, losing a job, not having your contract extended, etc. What we could do is because what we also see in previous research, that people are more afraid of the effects than they actually have to be. So people who do not engage in voice expect the cost in sense of retaliation and punishment to be larger than the people who mention having engaged in voice actually experience. So what we could do is somehow let people have a sort of a pre-experience of voice to teach them, to let them experience. So, and this is all abstract, but what I'm thinking of is to see or to discover, experiment what actually workplace voice training could, if we could arrange that as a sort of a thing in the curriculum of people's education. So, for instance, professional education, we do a lot in labor market preparation, but that doesn't involve how to voice and how to engage in workplace democracy. And I think that is potentially a way that we could intervene. Maybe even more meaningful, not me, easy than trying to change from this respect, the people's job level, job security level.
And we've got trainers in the room, so I think they're taking notes at the moment. Thanks, Agnes. Andrea, would you like to say a few words in answer?
Sorry. Not really, just eventually, because the question were not about worker-owned cooperatives. They were more about democracy in the workspace and about cost of participation, incentive for participation. Yeah, actually, I understand that is difficult in our post-modern society to organize workers that are very temporary, they are very insecure, flexible, and precarious. So I understand it is difficult also for the trade union to find a solution and strategies and tools to involve workers that are very, very precarious. Maybe we can start to regulate the work instead of the worker position, meaning having rights for any kind of work. So even for the very precarious, the delivery workers, have, for example, in Italy now there is a huge debate about having a basic, a minimum income per hours and so on. So maybe in other countries in the north of Europe this is already achieved, but for us it's still a path to to be reached. Okay.
Thanks. So maybe Andrew and then Stan and we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot more to add to what people said. I'll just try to answer some of the questions that perhaps haven't been addressed. On the time and precarious workers and participation. I mean, I'm a fan of universal basic income. I know that's controversial within the trade union movement, but I don't see that as opposing the need to have collective rights and minimum wages and good minimum wages and decent work and living. But I do think Eric Olin Wright's point about the universal basic income, if it's done properly, is it does give people a choice of how they use their labor, and therefore what they then choose to participate in, and I think that's really important. Yeah, the other thing, unions need to get on board with, as I said already, what's going on outside the world of work. Otherwise, they do become this vested interest, and I think having an alternative agenda and narrative is really important around those things. Sorry, I've got the window cleaner just arrived outside my window. But I do think also the question about young people is really important. I don't think young people are more individualistic. I think they have very different identities to perhaps previous generations. They're growing up in very different times, particularly with precarious work and climate emergency and so on. So I think unions need to think about how they connect with younger people and their material realities. I think that's really important. So the final thing I'd say is about democracy within unions is really important, and education processes. And I know unions have a lot of problems at the moment in the conditions they face macroeconomically, but I do think continuing to have good education programs around what's going on in the workplace, but also being able to speak to what's going on in the broader capitalist economy and how we think about that as collective actors is really important.
Thanks, Andrew. Stan, maybe you want to, yes, please.
I'll be very quick because I know there are excellent cookies waiting for us and coffee. So I have a few
those
questions that were addressed to me. The first one on the riders. I think you're right. So we have to think about other ways of organizing. These guys organize anyway in riders unions across company borders. In this case, works council should be seen as a means to an end, right? Not as an end itself. And I think through collective bargaining, you can think about through other ways of organizing workers' voice in this kind of companies. So that's a very quick question, but we can address it further in the coffee. Second question on consultation as an alternative. Yes, if it's backed by power, if it's backed by collective power, if you just have consultation rights with some people you elect without any backing, without any collective voice of the employees, no. And that's my main point. All this kind of institutions, if you don't correct the power indifference in the firms, they're not effective and they're not good. And then two more points about the fact that you were let go about Enel. I think this is a moral question. You don't fire a pregnant woman. Why not? Because we don't think that's okay in our society. And in the same way, you don't fire somebody who wants to speak up, because we're in a democratic society and speaking up is part of what we do. That's what we value in our society. We have to make sure that this morality comes back into the behavior of the management. And I want to end with a hopeful message, if I'm allowed to do that. For another panel, I'm a data guy, right? So I look into old surveys, okay? And on a certain moment, I found a survey, the International Social something survey, I don't remember, of the 1990s. And they have asked a very interesting question until the 1990s to all the people. The question was, how do you think, who should run a company? Who should run a firm? Should it be the employees alone? Should it be the employees with the management? Or should it be the management alone? And the results were that only 40% of the people thought that management should govern a company. Another 40% thought that it should be jointly. And I think 20 to 15%, I forgot one category, I'm very sorry, thought it should be the employees alone. So we're discussing something here that is in the imagination of our society is far away. But if you ask people straight away, like, do you think who should manage a company actually? then people tend to, at least in the 1990s, tend to support our message. So this is hopefully as a hopeful end of the session.
Beautiful. As a conclusion, thank you very much, Stan, and thanks a lot to the speakers, to the audience for your patience and questions as well. I'm sorry we could not address more and discuss more, but it's true we run a bit on time. But the presentations were amazing, very interesting. And I think this is a still open issue, right? It's as Stan mentioned before, it's core. The issue of workplace democracy, economic democracy, is core of in the trade union movement debate. So we will keep talking about this for long. So thanks a lot. Thanks to Dominique, Swan, the technicians, the interpreters, and enjoy the coffee and wrap up session later on at 11.